Thank you all for joining us. Please enjoy the event.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Alejandra Vasquez Bauer. I am a fellow on the Pre-K 12 education team at the Century Foundation, and I'm in an office wearing a black turtleneck, a black blazer, and black glasses with gold jewelry on. I will pass it along to my co-moderator to introduce herself.
King's Floyd. I use she, her pronouns. I present as a white woman wearing black glasses and brown hair in a ponytail, wearing a red blazer and floral shirt. For accessibility purposes today, we have ASL interpreters, sign language, as well as cart captioning in both English and Spanish. If you are having trouble accessing these services, please send a message to the Century Foundation in the chat.
Thank you, Kings. During today's event, we will discuss how to support immigrant students with disabilities. The Trump administration has enacted several inhumane immigration policies that have already had devastating consequences on the health, stability, and safety of immigrant communities. Some of the most acutely impacted individuals are immigrant students with disabilities, their parents, and the staff that provides critical mandated services. We are here today to engage with researchers, educators, and advocates working at the intersection of immigration and student disability justice to discuss these recent attacks on immigrant families and what can be done to protect immigrant students with disabilities. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. And if you would like to submit a question for our panelists, please do so using the chat feature. And with that, I'm very excited to welcome our incredible panel. Thank you all for coming. We will go around and I ask if you all could please introduce yourselves, provide a brief image description with your name, pronouns, title, and organization, and how your work intersects with this topic. We can start with Rita.
I am the director of the Immigrant Students' Rights Project at Advocates for Children of New York. I present as a Latina woman with curly hair and a black and brown background behind me. In my role as director of Immigrant Students' Rights, I help families, including newly arrived families, navigate the special education process from initial referral all the way to litigation where necessary in cases where children have been denied a free and appropriate public education. Very happy to be here today.
Thanks so much, Rita. Joylani. Joylani, I'm not sure if you are off mute.
We're having technical difficulties for the moment, so we will pass it instead to Jane.
Hello, my name is Jane Kim. I am an educator and an advocate. I use she, her pronouns, and I present as an Asian woman wearing a black top with a white cardigan, and I have long black hair with a blurred background behind me. I have been in classroom teaching, specifically in a school for the deaf, for over a decade, and now I am working as an education specialist in a hospital setting, supporting students as they're identified with hearing loss and any degree of deafness, making sure that they are in the correct placements, and getting any kind of support they need on the bridge between education and their medical needs being supported. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Jane. Chinma.
Good afternoon. My name is Chidima Ojiaku. I use she, her pronouns. I am wearing a blue jean jacket. I present as a Black Nigerian American woman. I have dark brown locked hair. I have silver earrings. My background is blurred. I'm honored to be here as an intervention specialist, also a classroom teacher for multilingual deaf and hard of hearing learners. I'm also a PhD candidate at Georgia State University. My work here intersects with today's conversation through my commitment to uplifting the voices of deaf multilingual learners, as well as supporting educators and incorporating the students' home language into the classrooms. This work is deeply personal and professional for me, and I believe that language is not just communication, it's identity, community, and empowerment for students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chidima. And Joelani.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Hi, my name is Joylani Moran. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm the Programs and Operations Assistant at the American Association of Peoples with Disabilities, AAPD. I am a brown-skinned Latina with clear glasses, blue headset on, and I'm wearing a beige plaid vest with a white shirt, and I have my background blurred in the living room. In my work, I support AAPD's internships programs with a focus on developing the future disability leaders. And I also assist AAPD's Chief Operating Officer with operational and cross-team consideration. My work contributes to building inclusive paths for disabled youth, including those from immigrant communities, by supporting the access to professional development and leadership opportunities. At AAPD, we advocate for disability rights and equity across all areas of society, including education, employment, and civic engagement, many of which directly affect immigrant students with disabilities. And I'm here today to share my personal experience as a student, as an immigrant student with a disability. You can't see it from my screen, but I also have a physical disability and I use a manual wheelchair to navigate.
Amazing. This is Kings. Thank you all so much, panelists, for your introduction. We will move into the questions or the rest of the questions. As a reminder to panelists, if you would please say your name before speaking and speak at a regular pace so that our CART captioners and our ASL interpreters can provide the appropriate accommodations. And with that, I will start with the broad question. We would love it if you could help our audience understand some of the barriers at play for immigrant students with disabilities. May that be language, cultural and philosophical, financial and bureaucratic. And as part two of the question, how have you seen these elements come into play in your role prior to the 2024 election and now? And I will throw it to Jailani to start the answer.
Thank you, Kings. I think that in particular, there are layered barriers that students with disabilities face. But in immediacy, I would say language is one of them. Not only is translation often unavailable, but is sometimes poor quality. And often in these systems, people assume that the families receiving service understand and are familiar with the US special education laws and processes, which oftentimes they are not. And culturally speaking, a lot of the families may come from backgrounds where disability is heavily stigmatized, where there isn't an equivalent um, system as the US has for education. And this creates a lot of hesitation and fear from families specifically. From my personal experience, I can tell you that it was very difficult for my mom and my grandma to understand special education services when I first immigrated to the States, and the availability for them to receive translation services was limited, which often forced me as the student to be the translator.
Thank you for that personal reflection on your experiences and the experiences of your family. We'll throw it to Jane.
Yes, this is Jane speaking. I would definitely echo what was shared in terms of just language access for our families. I come from a context where I am in New York City, where there are so many different languages present in our city. And making sure that there is not only live interpreting for important meetings, but for documents that are shared, for example, after an IEP meeting. Oftentimes, you might have a live interpreter for the meeting, but the documents provided at the meeting are still in English or not accessible in the home language. Or we have families who may not be literate in any language. And the concept that, because you had a live Spanish interpreter, for example, for the meeting does not necessarily mean you can just provide documentation in Spanish and expect the family to just understand everything that is written in what is often language that is appropriate for legal systems or educational systems and professionals who are knowledgeable in that field, and not necessarily accessible for families who are seeking services for their children. And I think the expectation for families to understand how to navigate healthcare systems, educational systems, is often a challenge, because we often have grace for folks to be able to not understand maybe a transit system when they're abroad in another country. It's like, oh, that's expected. You're not going to understand the system. And a transit system, I would say, is in ways a lot easier to understand and figure out than the American healthcare system or educational system. And so I think that definitely presents as a barrier. What we are noticing in present day is also the continued difficulty with accepting new diagnoses of disabilities, depending on cultural background and what the notion might be from that culture of what a disability entails and what the child's life might look like, and the grief that is involved with just a family accepting that what they thought might be their child's life might not be the same, or what their life as a parent might look like. That process has been enhanced by also existing fears that our immigrant populations face in the current administration.
And which of our other panelists would like to step in and next and build off of these two robust answers?
I can add, thank you. Just to echo what others have said, one of the biggest barriers we see is also around language as advocates. And in terms of language access, the biggest barriers, the points where we see this being the most difficult is during the IEP meeting itself. and in accessing and understanding the IEP once it's been drafted and sent to parents. I like that Jane pointed out the issue of lower literacy among some immigrant communities, all communities, but we see this, it's not just lower literacy, but it's also the difference in language. And so in New York City, for example, although parents have a right to receive translations of all special education documents, the school district sadly does not automatically provide these. And so parents have to request them, and often parents are not aware of this right. And we have families that come to us where for their entire child's education, the parent never had the opportunity to read an IEP in their language. And although parents have a right to an interpreter at IEP meetings, sometimes schools assign staff to serve as interpreters, but they're not trained to be interpreters, and they're often not impartial. We see sometimes at meetings where these school staff will not interpret whole chunks of what someone has said, and the parent is left there in the dark. And there may be challenges even with over the phone interpretation, which we know is available to all schools, where the interpreter may speak in a different dialect than the parent, or they're unfamiliar with special education terms, and so they may not fully interpret what the school or the parent is saying. And without parents being able to communicate effectively, although it is their right to participate meaningfully in their child's education, it's often impossible for them to do so, or to advocate for their children, or even something as simple as being able to check in to see if their children are receiving the services that are on their IEPs.
Thank you. Really appreciate that answer. And want to make a note. We apologize for the issue in our captioning services. We are working on addressing that issue. Oh, I believe it is coming up here. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and with that, I will pass it off to Chidima.
Thank you, Kings. I just wanted to, kind of piggyback to our other panelists, what they have mentioned, but specifically my role as an intervention specialist for multilingual deaf learners. I'd like to bring to the discussion some of the issues that our deaf and hard of hearing students learn or arrive with. Many have arrived without full access to language, whether it be English, but any language per se, even their home language that they come into the country with. Sometimes families come from cultures that are misunderstood, which makes communication with schools even harder, like some of the other panelists mentioned. Other things that they struggle with is financial constraints. In regards to DHH, deaf and hard of hearing students, sometimes the parents don't have the financial capabilities to purchase technology and equipment that are necessary for their education, such as hearing aids, whether it be they need cochlear implants. Sometimes the parents don't have that access or knowledge of the support where to access those things. Also, like what was mentioned, the special education process, the IEP process, which was already mentioned, and then the limited awareness to their rights. Families don't know that their children are legally entitled to accessible communication and language that's supported under IDEA. So schools in turn sometimes fail to recognize and meet those needs and make the families aware that they have these rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will throw it back to you again for our next question to start. And that is, how would you say the political and logistical landscape around all of these issues for immigrant students with disabilities, how have they changed over the last 6 months?
I would say that there has been some rising fears around immigration, weaker protections for their rights, overburdened school systems struggling to meet students' needs. So I would say all of these things are new fears that have arrived with this new administration.
And Rita, what do you think would have been some of the changes in the landscape around immigrant students with disabilities?
Well, speaking about New York City specifically, New York City in the last 2.5, 3 years, we've welcomed hundreds of thousands of newly arrived immigrant families, many who are living in temporary housing and shelters, many who are most actually who are also undocumented or seeking asylum. So we have experienced in New York City, not directly related to the administration, but just to what's happening here, is we have a lot of backlogs. We have a lot of delays in getting students evaluated, delays in getting students placed in appropriate settings based on their IEPs and what's recommended in their IEPs. We also are having more issues with translation and interpretation simply because there aren't enough staff at schools to help families, and they often don't know that they have, the ability to use language line and to seek resources from the school district's central offices. And like others have mentioned, we've also seen a ton of fear, which I will get to maybe later in some of the other questions, but we definitely have seen a lot of fear, parents not seeking special education for their children, or simply not sending their kids to school, in which case that they miss the special education services that they're entitled to that day.
So it sounds like really a slowdown in the intersections of both of these systems in terms of immigration and students with disabilities. Joy Lenny, what can you add to that?
Well, Rita, I'm glad you mentioned the homeless population or unhoused population. As a student, I've lived in shelters, and I can tell you that it becomes very difficult for the shelter system to support students when language is a barrier and when parents are fearful of what might happen if their students access certain services. And that is really an obstacle because the services are there, but people are afraid to use them. And also there is an overload of people needing the services. So it becomes difficult to be able to support the students and their families as they should be supported just because there's too many of them. I've volunteered regularly with education liaison for the homeless population here in New York City, and I know that they've tried to create different mentorship programs and different supports for students who are unhoused, and it becomes very difficult when they're just fearful of what might happen because of the restrictions that this new administration has put like nationwide.
Thank you for raising so many of these intersectional issues. Jane, anything to round out the answers to these questions?
Yes, I would absolutely agree that there is increased levels of fear, of retaliation, of consequences, at least in the New York City school system. Often it is the parent, guardian, the caregivers who have to initiate the process to even start the evaluations to eventually determine what services students with disabilities are going to receive. And in the last 6 months, I have noticed that families are hesitant or would rather opt to decline help or support for fear of having a longer quote unquote paper trail or having more eyes on them, whether it's more doctor visits, more documentation of needs, and just having the sense that if I have more eyes on my situation or more eyes on my child, it's going to lead to increased surveillance and potentially increased consequences. And so, there was a family that I knew of where the home went up in flames. And it was really a community effort to provide the needed supports in the direct aftermath, because the family was hesitant to rely on a formal organization's help in that setting because they are fearful, and rightfully so, of the potential repercussions of receiving organizational help. So community advocates, community support, school support, and just individuals, everyday folks have been critical just support in a time when people are hesitant to be involved in systems and organizations.
This is Alejandra. Thank you to our panelists for these really thoughtful responses so far from both your personal and professional perspectives at the intersection of immigration and disability justice. I'm going to pass it off to Rita. So you represent New York City's immigrant origin students and their families in special education cases. What are the primary issues students with disabilities in immigrant communities here are dealing with? I know you've touched on some of that so far in your responses, but specifically thinking about changes in immigration policy at the federal level, how they're affecting New York City students that you support in receiving their legally mandated services.
Thanks, Alejandra. I want to first start by clarifying that there have been no changes yet at the federal level which directly impact the ability of New York City students to receive their legally mandated special education services. We hope this doesn't change, but I want to make this clear because we want to ensure that families continue to request special education evaluations and services for their children, especially if they suspect that there is a disability that's impacting their learning. In terms of the primary issues that students with disabilities in immigrant communities are dealing with in New York City, sadly, it hasn't changed, but there are three that I'm going to focus on. The first is the lack of bilingual programs and bilingual providers and teachers. A longstanding problem in New York City and across the United States is a shortage of bilingual special education educators, clinicians, and therapists. And, as you can imagine, school districts can't open bilingual special education classrooms if there aren't teachers to staff them. And students cannot receive their mandated bilingual related services if there aren't therapists available to provide those services. And students can't be evaluated to determine whether they even qualify for special education if there aren't sufficient bilingual psychologists to perform the required assessments. Many students who require bilingual special education are, in New York City at least, instead placed in monolingual English classrooms. So you're talking about a child who would really benefit from being in a classroom with a teacher who's bilingual, who's providing instruction in, say, English and Spanish. But instead they're being placed in monolingual English classrooms with the help sometimes of a language paraprofessional who's just a person who sits with them and helps them interpret during the school day, if there's one available. And oftentimes they're also given related services authorizations. They're kind of like vouchers, so that families have to look for bilingual therapists outside of their school on their own time because there isn't somebody in their school who can do it. This means that students are not being served according to their needs or what's required by law, and also it's putting parents in an awkward position because now they have the burden of having to find providers in their communities to provide services for their children. Another issue is delays in providing initial evaluations and initial services. Children who are new to New York City and require bilingual evaluations often wait a very long time to be evaluated for special education. And it's usually far beyond the timelines that schools need to abide by as set forth in the IDEA. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are even longer delays because in New York City, at least, because we do have a very high number of newly arrived students who require bilingual evaluations, and the wait times are really astronomical. This is usually as a result of lack of bilingual evaluators, but it could also be as a result of delays in getting the child referred for special education. And this is a point that I want to make here because it's a little nuanced. So there are delays, and once a parent requests an evaluation, then the school has to abide by a certain timeline after the parent gives consent to have their child evaluated. What we're seeing as well is that some schools are simply not accepting the referral or trying to talk a parent out of it by claiming illegally and falsely that English language learners have to wait a certain period of time before they can be evaluated for special education services. And this period of time can be a year. Some schools say 2 years, and this is all completely false. It's also not according to law. And what schools say is that, well, we have to wait to make sure that it's not a language issue. But if we are going to trust the evaluations that are being provided to students, those evaluations should be able to distinguish between whether a child is having issues with learning English or they have an actual disability that's impacting their learning that is not related to learning English. I also want to remind our audience that newly arrived students who received some kind of special education support in their previous countries can qualify to receive services while they wait for the special education process to be completed. This is what's called a comparable services plan. It's basically a set of services that, or even being placed in a classroom, that a student can receive in the meantime, because sometimes these processes take a very long time. And just want to remind everybody, parents can show documentation if they have it. It can be a letter from a doctor, it can be a school note, it can be a transcript, but it's not necessary if they can prove that their child was indeed receiving services in their previous country. The third and last issue, which we have talked about now in great detail, so I won't go into it further, is language access, because this remains a big issue. And recently, as we've noted, it's become an even bigger issue in New York City just because of the lack of available providers and interpreters. One thing that we're seeing now because of the new administration is parents are afraid to ask for special education evaluations. They basically have told us that they don't want to be seen as a burden to society. Other parents who are familiar with the Trump's first administration are afraid of being considered a public charge if they receive special education services, which, as we know, is not the case, and certainly not the case yet. Hopefully that doesn't change either. Families are also just simply afraid to go to schools or in-person events at school and meetings. And so we are seeing that families will cancel last minute, or they won't show up if the school is offering, a workshop on how to understand special education, because they fear, being in a room or in a space where they could potentially be targeted. And families generally are also afraid to advocate for their children. We heard a parent tell us that they don't want to ruffle any feathers and they don't want to draw attention to themselves. So, for example, if a child is not receiving a certain set of services on their IEP, the parents will just stay quiet. They won't reach out to the school. They won't make any demands because they don't want to draw any attention to themselves. And lastly, children are just missing school. We are, every day we're hearing of families who are not sending their kids to school, or they'll send them some days, but not others, because they're worried or because they have issues. The family has an issue that they're trying to grapple with, an immigration related issue. So they're afraid of sending their kids to school because they don't know what's going to happen at the end of the school day. But we just really cannot emphasize enough that all students still, and hopefully throughout this administration, documented or not, have the right to receive special education. And we want to make sure that students are getting evaluated, that parents are pushing to have the evaluations done, to have appropriate IEPs, and that they litigate where necessary. If a school is not giving a student what they need, a free and appropriate public education as is required by law, all parents, included undocumented parents, have a right to start a legal proceeding, to file an impartial hearing request, to make sure that there's a remedy for what's happening for having been denied a free and appropriate public education.
Thank you so much, Rita. This is Alejandra again. That was an excellent and really robust response about what is going on in New York City around bureaucratic and staffing barriers, addressing the fear that many others have talked about as well in their answers. I'd like to throw it to Chinma, and maybe to build off of the language access pieces, how do you think language access plays a role in bridging the gap between students, their families, and the communities around them? And specifically, what do you wish people understood about language barriers specifically for deaf and hard of hearing students?
Thank you. I would say language access, it means everything. Language connects families, students, it connects them to learning, it connects them to their own families, it gives them a sense of identity. It's a beautiful thing when schools are able to support both home languages, sign languages, any type of language, because it builds trust, it builds inclusion, and it builds real belonging. So language itself is so important, and it's important for our students to be able to have that access. As far as deaf and hard of hearing students, again, because of their hearing loss, language, again, is so essential. Again, the access to it, whether it's their home language, whether it's English, just the access to it, specifically for deaf, hard of hearing students, visuals. Visuals are a form of language access as well. And so it's very important that, deaf, hard of hearing students have access to visuals. Students particularly can use ASL to make language visual. So again, just access to language, and I just wish people would understand that newly students that are arriving, they come with limited access to language, but exposing them to, you know, a full linguistic repertoire of language will help bridge the gap. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate such comprehensive answers with the expertise that you bring to the table. As a reminder to our audience members, this is Kings, by the way. As a reminder to our audience members, if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to either submit them in the chat, or if you are viewing via our YouTube feature in the comments section. We look forward to being able to answer your questions. My next question, however, is for Jane. Jane, given your experience in the classroom, how do you think students' access to mental health services specifically is being affected by the current political and immigration issues? And what mental health resources would you recommend to these students and their families?
Sorry, thank you for that question. Mental health is often an area of our health that is so critical, but often neglected. And I think that is across the board for children and adults, those who are able-bodied and those with disabilities. And so I would say that, like we mentioned before, the heightened fear, heightened anxiety and stress from everything that has been happening in this year due to actions or inactions by this administration has definitely created continuous stress responses, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Students just being in a state of constant fear, whether it is for themselves, for family members, or even their peers in school. And so we're also seeing teachers, educators, providers who are also coping with everything that is happening. And so you have dysregulated adults trying to help students with disabilities regulate themselves. And while we would hope for increased mental health counselors and support staff in the schools, we also recognize that classroom teachers and other kind of educational staff have been in some way or form supporting the mental health of students, and especially with students with disabilities. If possible, we would love for them to be able to access services to counseling, having it added on their IEP if necessary. But again, back to, I believe it was Rita who brought it up, that the inadequate number of providers to be able to meet the needs that are especially growing amidst, especially the last 6 months of rapid fire executive orders that we have experienced, that we may not necessarily yet feel the physical and actual implications, but the barrage of chaos that is perceived does lead to dysregulated mental health. And so we are also with a generation of students and students with disabilities who also have constant access online. Technology has been amazing to support language access, accessibility, and all the things. And at the same time, the same great tool also increases access to anything online, whether that is vetted or not. And so even with students, where my background is with deaf learners, where if you have a child who has been language deprived for so long and they are physically, mentally, and all their capacities a teenager, but their language abilities is that of, let's say, a kindergartner. Are they fully understanding what they're seeing online? Are they fully processing it? And then is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation being shared? that is another challenge because we don't know what they're seeing outside of school on their phones, on their tablets, or are you seeing the news constantly playing at your local pizzeria or restaurant or, barbershop, and you don't have access to what's being played? And so are you only getting visual graphic images? So mental health is definitely an increased concern. Families, depending on their cultural background, are they even aware of how much mental health impacts their child, their own family, and the psychosomatic responses that they might be seeing? So that is in addition to any other kind of barriers that they may face due to the inaccessibility of the society that they live in. And so I would say that for resources, at least in the space of New York, there is a website called HITESITE, HITESITE.org. I believe it's a website. It's kind of a hub for, I believe it stands for health. I don't recommend the I, but remember the I, but health something tools empowerment. And so it's basically a hub where you could find social services or counselors or psychotherapists in community organizations that are tailored to culture and language. New York City also has Talkspace, which is kind of like an online digital free tool for teenagers to engage with mental health professionals 24/7, 365. If families are significantly concerned, always reach out to their classroom teachers to see if there needs to be an evaluation to add on school counseling to their IEPs. And then just at the national level, NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, and Psychology Today also has extracurricular options for things to be accessed via maybe medical insurance.
Thank you, Jane. Appreciate that answer. And we have a lot to think about in kind of organizing all of these services that students need, especially around mental health. Jailani, this next question is for you. How can organizations that serve immigrant populations better support immigrant students with disabilities?
I think the most important way that organizations that serve immigrant populations need to think intentionally about disability inclusion in their work, not just as an afterthought. That means hiring staff with expertise both in immigration and disability, investing in interpretation services and cultural competency, and forming strong partnerships with disability rights organizations. And that goes vice versa to disability rights organizations, ensuring that they are including immigrant populations in their work. Also, trust building is extremely important and key to this area right now. Many immigrant families won't disclose a disability unless they feel safe, understood, and not at risk. And training frontline staff, offering wraparound services, and ensuring accessibility in both programming and spaces can make a huge difference.
The intersectionality definitely goes both ways, and I see my co-moderator Alejandra giving some snaps to your answer about hiring the people that need to be in the room in order to make these programs and policies more accessible. Alejandra, I'll throw it to you for our next question.
Of course, and also just making sure that supporting students with disabilities is not an afterthought. I think, again, that's built into all responses to support immigrant families is a really good point that I also was snapping at over here in my corner. So again, this is Alejandra, and I have a final question for all of our panelists that we'll do a quick round 30-second responses before we then open up for Q&A. But I would love to hear from each of our panelists, which policies would you strengthen given the opportunity to in order to protect students with disabilities from immigrant origin families in the next 4 years and beyond. So which policies would you strengthen to support immigrant students with disabilities in the next 4 years and beyond? Let's start with Chidinma.
I would just say, just thinking about policies, I would just say, just focusing on thinking about, please come back to me.
That's totally fine. Jane, do you want to get us started here?
Sure. I know language has been a huge thing that we've talked about in our time together, and just making sure that we are supporting policies, but also local community organizations doing the work of making sure that things are translated, interpreted, making sure that we are providing funding for interpreter programs. Like it was mentioned, that we're not just relying on a bilingual staff member to be pulled into a meeting without confidentiality training or bias training when it comes to interpreting. And also, I'm thinking of, because I'm in the New York City context and also because I am a Teachers College alum, knowing that the Deaf Ed Fund program, they had a 5-year grant that was recently cut because they were perceived to be out of compliance with this current administration. And so that impacts future educators of the deaf and hard of hearing being trained and being developed. And we are unable to have bilingual or culturally competent providers, educators, therapists, all of the above, if we cannot train them and if we cannot support the programs that are trying to train them, and if we're taking away all their funding. So funding local organizations doing the work and making sure that policies are in place so that these organizations and institutions and local grassroots organizations are able to receive the funding that they need to do the work that will pour into future generations.
Yes, throw the money where the work is. Love it, Jane. Thank you. Rita.
I really like your point, Jane, about funding community-based organizations and supporting CBOs, because they really fill in when there are gaps. And I think that's really important. Another thing I would say is another policy or effort I would say is around informing parents of their rights, and in a way that's clear, that's accessible. I know that in New York City, we have contributed and helped with campaigns, language access campaigns, information campaigns around special education. And I think that we need more of that. We need parents to know what their rights are, to feel comfortable going to schools and advocating for themselves and their children. And I think we need to have stronger policies around funding schools for parent engagement as well. I think we sometimes overlook parent engagement because we're thinking about TNI and language access a lot, which is great, but there's also a component of parent engagement that also has to be in there too, because we want our parents to feel welcome and safe in our schools, in particular our immigrant parents who often feel scared or intimidated. And so we want to make sure that at the very least, they feel comfortable at the school level, even if they don't feel comfortable doing other things like going, taking a legal route, for example.
Thank you, Rita. Joylani, quick responses.
Yeah. If I had the opportunity, I would strengthen public charge protections, just because we want families to be able to access services without the fear of being deported or just not receiving the services that they need. And I would agree with what my co-panelists have said, that funding community-based organizations is important because they often provide that support through the gaps that are not able to be supported by other systems. And lastly, I would say that most importantly, it's ultimately important that policies recognize the intersectionality between disability, immigration status, race, and language. Otherwise, we're leaving people behind.
Thank you. And lastly, Chidinma.
Thank you. Like Jane mentioned, I would say teacher prep programs, as well as Our related service providers that provide services to students being aware of, culturally responsive ways to be inclusive. I think some of our related service providers aren't really familiar, and so they come into IEP meetings or they come into professional development meetings and or sessions, and they're not culturally linguistically trained to deal with our students. So I would say trainings, teacher prep programs, as well as helping educators learn how to create inclusive classrooms, because we deal with that too. Our students coming into classrooms where they're coming from different cultures or their linguistic status is different than the majority. And so I think just creating inclusive classrooms and professionals that are well versed or knowledgeable about different cultures.
Excellent. Thank you all for an incredible panel and your panel answers. We appreciate you all. We'll jump into Q&A. Reminder for folks who are watching, please enter your questions into the chat or in the YouTube comment section. And we'll start with a question that was put into the Q&A here for Rita. Legally, what is the time frame for the school and in which they must evaluate a student and create an IEP plan?
Thanks for that question. So the initial part, the first step of the process is for a parent to make a request for a special education evaluation or for the school to engage the parent in that conversation. And then once that happens, then the parent is sent a consent form. Once the parent signs that consent form and returns it to the school has to complete all evaluations and create the IEP within 60 school days. So that doesn't include weekends, and it doesn't include school holidays. 60 school days, which depending on the time of year, could mean a few months, could mean 3 months if it's around the holidays or school vacations, but it's 60 school days. And we're seeing that being violated over and over and over again, but that is the legal requirement.
Thank you, Rita, for that answer. Another question we have from a question submitted ahead of time. What concerns do you have regarding Trump moving education funds for people with special needs to Health and Human Services or another department at the federal level? I'll actually start with Kings and then open it up to others if they'd like to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandra. So there is a piece that my colleagues and I at the Century Foundation put out that I will drop in the chat that talks exactly about some of these concerns that people have about moving or completely abolishing the Department of Education. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, covers about 7.5 million students. And while Trump can't scrape IDEA or its funding without congressional approval, it could technically move IDEA to another government agency. The risk with that is paramount. It means, along with the reduction in forces that have been happening across the federal government, there will be less people to administer these programs, which include allotting federal funding to states in order to conduct their special education programming, including conducting IEPs and 504 plans. Students with disabilities who have learning or speech disabilities rely on federal protections to get services. And if they get moved to another agency, they won't be enforced, although we know that they're not necessarily being enforced well at this time in the agency they currently reside in. So there are ripple effects in both funding and day-to-day administrative and learning opportunities that will get disrupted if Trump moves the funding over from the Department of Education to HHS or another agency. back to some of the other panelists that I want to jump into this question.
This is Jane, and I'm going to be mindful of our time together. Because of just the notion that of who the audience is here and the panelists gathered here and those who are hopefully watching this, that yes, the risks are paramount and there is a lot at stake with everything that is being threatened. And we know that from the families we have met and the educators we work with and the colleagues we work with in our respective spaces, that we are amongst some of the fiercest advocates for these students with disabilities. And so though the risks and what we are faced with are very frightening and worrisome, and this is not to gaslight or bypass any of those feelings, but it also is a reminder to hold on to resilience and hope, and knowing that the work has continued despite many of these sparse conditions and harsh conditions that have existed in the past. They will continue to be strengthened and be formed in community as we continue, and that the power really does rely in the continued advocacy of the families and of the professionals who work with these families and our students. And the students themselves are just really strong advocates for their needs and their rights.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane and Kings, for those answers. I'd like to ask a final question coming from the YouTube chat. We have talked a lot about policies and challenges facing immigrant students with disabilities, and we'd like to our viewers to go home with some tangible next steps, especially those who are working in schools. And so wondering what efforts, what actions school leaders can take now to build trust and relationships with parents and create a school culture that explicitly supports immigrant students with disabilities, protects them from bias, and prepares staff for potentially increased fear or trauma under Trump 2.0. Would anybody like to jump in with that?
I can start quickly. I think one of sort of the best practices that we've seen, not just around this issue, but other sensitive issues, is schools working with community-based organizations and partnering with community-based organizations that provide culturally sensitive, culturally relevant work, that have staff that speak multiple languages, and that parents may turn to anyway, even though they don't collaborate with schools, because we want to make sure that parents feel the schools are invested in them, that they're actually doing the work to make sure that they're providing services and a space that is safe and comfortable and welcoming. And I think doing that in partnership with community-based organizations is really important. Secondly, I would say that schools should work as much as possible with each other, creating best practices, learning from other schools, other principals, other staff in their own buildings, to make sure that they feel strong as an individual unit. So despite what's happening outside, that they create an environment internally that is safe. And that includes training all teachers, all staff, all front-facing staff on culturally sensitive practices, on how to be welcoming, on how to provide proper language access, for example. And doing that, I think, really shows to families that the schools are putting forth the effort to make sure that parents feel welcome and that students are being served properly.
Excellent. I saw Chinma and Joylani. Chinma, do you want to add anything to Rita's comments?
I think that Rita hit the nail on the head. And I just think, to just close it, I would just say, just creating a safe space. When children come into the doors of the school, we just want them to be safe. And with this, all these policy changes, like we mentioned before, there is fear. So I think all in all, just making sure it's a safe space where all students have the ability to learn.
Thank you. And Joylani, please close us out.
Yes, of course. I have to agree with my co-panelists. I think the most important thing is to remember that school is a safe place for a lot of students. So let's try and do our best to maintain that.
Thank you all for these great questions, and thanks to everyone watching. I'll pass it off to my colleague Kings to close us out.
Thank you, everyone, so much for attending this webinar today. Thank you to our panelists for being here and sharing your personal and professional experience. Thank you to our access interpreters, both our sign language interpreters, our Spanish language interpreters, and our CART captioners. And thank you to our audience members for your engagement and participation, as well as your advocacy in these intersectional fields. We hope you continue to stay involved and engaged with TCF, and we look forward to being in this fight with you all. Thank you so much. And thank you to our team at TCF as well. We appreciate everything that they did to make this webinar happen. Thank you all.